The autumn afternoon had settled over little paddocks with the gentle persistence of a cat choosing the most comfortable chair. Miss Jane Marple made her way along the village lane toward the parish hall, her knitting bag swinging softly at her side, and her sensible shoes making no sound on the worn cobblestones. She had been invited to the Chipping Cleghorn Literary Society's special meeting by her old friend Mrs. Swettenham, who had promised both excellent tea and an intriguing presentation about a recently discovered collection of local folklore. The parish hall buzzed with the sort of refined excitement that overtakes a village when something genuinely unusual is about to happen. Mrs. Swettenham, resplendent in her best purple hat, was arranging chairs with military precision while keeping one eye on the tea urn and another on the small display table where several leather-bound volumes lay waiting. The guest of honor, Miss Eleanor Finch, had not yet arrived, though she was expected momentarily with the crown jewel of the afternoon's program, a rare privately printed volume called Whispers of the Downs, said to contain stories and legends that had never appeared in any other collection. Miss Marple settled herself in a chair near the window, from where she could observe both the room and the lane outside. The assembled company represented the cream of Chipping Cleghorn's intellectual society, which was to say those residents who owned more than 20 books and could discuss them without blushing. Mr. Arthur Penhaligon, the local author whose historical romances had made him something of a celebrity, dominated one corner with his booming voice and expansive gestures. Mrs. Bantry sat with the vicar's wife, their heads bent together in the sort of urgent whispered conversation that suggested either scandal or recipes. Young Mrs. Lestrange, who had moved to the village only 3 months prior, perched nervously on the edge of her chair, clutching her teacup as though it might provide protection against some unnamed threat. The conversation turned, as it inevitably did in such gatherings, to books and their curious histories. Mr. Penhaligon was holding forth about the manuscript of his latest work when Mrs. Swettenham glanced at the clock and frowned. Miss Finch was now nearly 20 minutes late, which was entirely unlike her. Eleanor Finch was known throughout the village for her punctuality, her meticulous organization, and her passionate devotion to preserving local history. She had spent the better part of 10 years tracking down and acquiring rare books and documents related to the area, and her private library was said to be quite remarkable. "Perhaps I should telephone," Mrs. Swettenham murmured, but before she could move, young Timothy Dane burst through the door with the sort of energy that made teacups rattle in their saucers. Timothy helped his aunt, the postmistress, with deliveries and odd jobs around the village, and his usually cheerful face was now creased with worry. "Mrs. Swettenham," he gasped, still catching his breath, "I've just come from Miss Finch's cottage. She asked me to collect a parcel from the station this morning and bring it round at 4 o'clock, but when I got there—" He paused, looking around the room at the expectant faces. "The front door was standing wide open, and there was no answer when I called. I thought perhaps she'd stepped into the garden, but then I saw her study window. It's been smashed from the inside, and there's glass all over the rose bushes." A collective intake of breath swept through the room. Mrs. Lestrange's teacup clattered against its saucer, and she pressed a hand to her throat. Mr. Penhaligon's voice, for once, was reduced to a whisper as he asked, "Did you go inside, boy?" Timothy shook his head. I called out again, but there was such a queer feeling about the place. Everything too quiet, if you know what I mean. And the strangest thing, her study door was locked from the inside, but I could see through the keyhole that her desk had been turned over. Papers scattered everywhere. Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their steady rhythm, but her pale blue eyes had sharpened with interest. In her experience, when scholarly recluses failed to appear for appointments and their studies showed signs of violent disturbance, the explanation was rarely as simple as a burglary gone wrong. Books, particularly rare ones, had a way of inspiring passions that could prove quite dangerous. "We must telephone the police at once," declared Mrs. Swettenham, but even as she spoke, Dr. Haydock appeared in the doorway, his usually ruddy face grave with concern. "I'm afraid," he said quietly, "that someone has already done so. I've just come from Eleanor Finch's cottage." He paused, his gaze sweeping the assembled company before settling on Mrs. Swettenham. "I'm very sorry to have to tell you that Miss Finch is dead. It appears she suffered a severe blow to the head, though the circumstances are rather puzzling." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft tick of the wall clock and the distant sound of Mrs. Lestrange's sharp intake of breath. Miss Marple observed the faces around her with the sort of gentle attention she might give to a particularly interesting pattern in her knitting. Shock, certainly, but there were other expressions as well. Relief on one face, calculation on another, and something that might have been fear quickly masked by appropriate concern. "The police inspector is on his way from Much Benham," Dr. Haydock continued. "But I thought you should know, given that she was expected here this afternoon." He glanced at the displayed table with its waiting books. "I understand she was bringing something special to show you all." "The folklore collection," Mrs. Swettenham whispered. "Whispers of the Downs. She was so excited about it, said it contained stories that would change how we understood the history of this area." Miss Marple's needles paused for just a moment. In her long experience of human nature, she had learned that when people spoke of changing how things were understood, there were usually those who preferred that certain understandings remain unchanged. And when rare books went missing and their owners turned up dead, the explanation often lay not in the monetary value of the volumes, but in the secrets their pages contained. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the parish hall floor, and Miss Marple reflected that what had begun as a pleasant literary gathering had taken a turn toward something far more sinister. Somewhere in Chipping Cleghorn, a killer walked free, and she suspected that before this matter was resolved, more than one person's carefully constructed life would be turned as thoroughly as the pages of Miss Finch's mysterious book. The silence that followed Dr. Haydock's announcement stretched like a taut wire, broken only by the soft clink of Mrs. Lestrange setting down her teacup with trembling hands. Miss Marple observed how shock settled differently on each face around her, noting particularly how young Mrs. Lestrange had gone quite pale, while Mr. Penhaligon seemed almost energized by the dramatic turn of events, his novelist's mind already working. Within 20 minutes, Inspector Crail arrived from Much Benham, a compact, sandy-haired man whose brisk manner suggested he preferred his cases straightforward. He listened to Dr. Haydock's preliminary report with professional attention, took down names and addresses with efficient strokes of his pencil, and questioned Timothy Dane about his discovery with the sort of thoroughness that brought the boy's natural nervousness to the surface. "Right then," Inspector Crail announced, closing his notebook with a decisive snap. "I'll need to examine the scene properly. Dr. Haydock, if you'd accompany me. The rest of you, please remain here until I've had a chance to speak with each of you individually." Miss Marple found herself included in the small group that walked the short distance to Honeysuckle Cottage, though she had made no particular effort to insert herself into the investigation. Sometimes, she reflected, being a harmless elderly lady had distinct advantages. The cottage sat behind a neat privet hedge, its front door still standing open like a mouth caught mid-sentence. The study, when Inspector Crail led them inside, told a story that seemed both violent and oddly theatrical. Miss Finch lay crumpled beside her overturned desk, a dark stain spreading beneath her grey head. The room showed clear signs of disturbance, papers scattered across the floor, books tumbled from their shelves. Yet something about the disorder struck Miss Marple as curiously deliberate, as if someone had read about such scenes rather than lived through one. "Blow to the back of the head," Dr. Haydock confirmed quietly, kneeling beside the body. "This bookend here would have done it." He indicated a heavy carved owl that lay near the desk, its bronze surface dulled with something that might have been blood. Inspector Crail examined the shattered study window with particular interest. "Glass mostly on the outside," he muttered. "But the pattern's wrong for a break from within. Someone's tried to make it look like forced entry, but they've made a hash of it." Miss Marple's keen eyes had already noted several details that seemed to escape the inspector's immediate attention. There was a faint dusting of white powder on the windowsill. The same chalky residue she could see on the edge of the reading lectern and, most interestingly, on the carved owl's beak. The sort of French chalk that elderly ladies used to prevent their fingers from sticking to delicate old paper when turning pages. "The missing book," she ventured gently. "This Whispers of the Downs that Miss Finch was so eager to show us. I don't suppose it's been found." Inspector Crail glanced around the disordered room. "Nothing obvious missing that we can tell. Her purse is untouched on the mantelpiece, money still inside. But without knowing exactly what was here." He trailed off, then looked more sharply at Miss Marple. "You knew about this particular book?" "Oh yes, Miss Finch had been quite excited about it, a collection of local folklore, privately printed. She said it contained stories that would change how we understood the area's history." Miss Marple's tone was conversational, but her pale blue eyes were alert. "Such a pity if it's been damaged or lost." Timothy Dane, who had been hovering near the doorway, cleared his throat nervously. "Inspector, sir, there was a parcel I collected for Miss Finch this morning from the station, about the right size for a book. She was particular about me bringing it round at 4 o'clock sharp." "And where is this parcel now?" "Still at the parish hall, sir. I didn't like to leave it lying about, what with—" He gestured helplessly at the scene before them. As they prepared to return to the hall, Miss Marple lingered for a moment by the lectern where an ordinary volume of Tennyson lay open, a pressed flower marking a page. The flower had been disturbed, she noticed, one delicate petal lying separate from the rest, as if someone had brushed against it in passing. Such a small thing, yet in her experience, it was often the smallest details that proved most illuminating. The walk back to the parish hall was conducted in thoughtful silence, each member of the small group absorbed in their own reflections. Miss Marple found herself thinking about the curious combination of violence and careful staging they had witnessed, and about the way Mrs. Lestrange had reacted so strongly to the news of Miss Finch's death. In her long experience of human nature, she had learned that extreme reactions often indicated not grief, but guilt, and she wondered what connection the nervous young woman might have had to the missing book that had cost Eleanor Finch her life. Back at the parish hall, the atmosphere had thickened like cream left too long in the sun. Inspector Crail's return brought with it the sort of official gravity that made even innocent people examine their consciences. Miss Marple settled herself more comfortably in her chair by the window, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm as she observed the subtle shifts in posture and expression that accompanied the inspector's presence. "Now then," Inspector Crail announced, placing Timothy's parcel on the central table with ceremonial care. "Let's see what Miss Finch was so eager to share with you all." He produced a penknife and slit the string with practiced efficiency. The brown paper fell away to reveal exactly what had been promised, a handsome volume bound in dark green morocco, its spine lettered in faded gilt with the title Whispers of the Downs. The collective intake of breath was audible. Mrs. Swettenham leaned forward in her chair, while Mr. Penhaligon's eyes gleamed with the particular avarice of a collector. Mrs. Lestrange, Miss Marple noted, had gone quite still, her earlier nervousness replaced by something that looked remarkably like dread. Inspector Crail opened the book carefully, and as if it had been trained to do so, it fell naturally to a page midway through. The heading read, "The Governess of Meadowbrook Manor," and Miss Marple observed with interest how Mrs. Lestrange's hands tightened on the back of the chair she stood behind until her knuckles showed white as bone china. "Interesting," murmured Inspector Crail, scanning the page. "This appears to be about a scandal from 1898. A young woman employed at the local manor house who disappeared under mysterious circumstances." He looked up at the assembled company. "Anyone familiar with this particular story?" The silence stretched uncomfortably. Mr. Penhaligon cleared his throat and ventured that such tales were common enough in old families, while Mrs. Swettenham murmured something about the importance of preserving local history, however uncomfortable. But Miss Marple's attention was fixed on the small details that others seemed to miss. The way the book's pages showed signs of frequent handling, with faint pencil marks in the margins that suggested careful study, and how Mrs. Lestrange had begun to breathe in the shallow, rapid way of someone fighting panic. "Perhaps we should hear from each of you about your connection to Miss Finch," Inspector Crail continued, closing the book but keeping his hand resting on its cover. "Mrs. Swettenham, as the organizer of today's gathering." Mrs. Swettenham's account was thorough and precise. Miss Finch had telephoned the previous evening, she explained, expressing particular excitement about her latest acquisition. She said it contained stories that would surprise people, family histories that had been forgotten or deliberately overlooked. Eleanor was always dramatic about her discoveries, but this time she seemed genuinely thrilled, almost mischievous about it. Mr. Penhaligon, when called upon, proved characteristically expansive. He had known Miss Finch for several years through their mutual interest in local history, and she had often consulted him about historical details for his novels. She mentioned this particular book several times over the past fortnight, he admitted, said it shed new light on some of the area's more prominent families, the sort of thing that makes excellent research material, though I suspect some people might not appreciate having their ancestors' indiscretions aired publicly. Miss Marple's needles paused, almost imperceptibly at this observation. In her long experience, when family secrets were threatened with exposure, the reactions could be quite extreme indeed. Young Mrs. Lestrange, when her turn came, seemed barely able to speak above a whisper. She had moved to Chipping Cleghorn only recently, she explained, renting Rose Cottage on the village outskirts. Her interest in the literary society was purely academic, she claimed, stemming from a general fascination with local history that her late husband had shared. "Did you have any particular acquaintance with Miss Finch?" Inspector Crail inquired gently. "Not really, no. We'd spoken briefly at society meetings." Mrs. Lestrange's voice caught slightly. She seemed very knowledgeable about the area's past. I'd hoped to learn more from her about the local families and their histories. Miss Marple observed how the young woman's eyes kept returning to the book on the table, as if it were a snake that might strike at any moment. There was something in her expression that suggested not mere curiosity about local history, but a deeply personal concern about what those pages might contain. Inspector Crail allowed a moment of silence to settle before asking, "I don't suppose any of you noticed anything unusual about Miss Finch's behavior recently? Any suggestion that she might have been worried or excited about something in particular?" Timothy Dane spoke up hesitantly. "She had been asking me to collect parcels more often lately, sir. Books and papers from dealers in London and such places, and she'd taken to locking her study door, which she'd never done before. Said she didn't want anyone disturbing her research until she was ready to share it." "Research into what, specifically?" "Family trees, sir. Genealogies and such. She had charts spread all over her desk, connecting names and dates. Said she was putting together quite a complete picture of how the old families were all related to each other." Mrs. Lestrange made a small sound, quickly stifled, but Miss Marple's sharp ears caught it. The young woman was clearly distressed by this line of conversation, and Miss Marple found herself wondering what connection she might have to the families Miss Finch had been researching so diligently. As Inspector Crail made notes and prepared to examine the crime scene more thoroughly, Miss Marple requested permission to look at the book briefly. "Just curiosity, you understand," she said in her gentle way. "I do so enjoy local folklore." The inspector, perhaps recognizing something in her quiet manner, handed over the volume without objection. Miss Marple turned the pages carefully, noting the pencil marks in the margins and the way certain passages had been underlined. The story of the governess was indeed compelling. A young woman named Catherine who had arrived at Meadowbrook Manor in 1897, only to disappear the following year under circumstances that had caused considerable scandal. The family had left the area shortly afterward, selling the estate and relocating to London to escape the gossip. What caught Miss Marple's particular attention, however, was a small notation in Miss Finch's careful handwriting at the bottom of the page. CL, verify marriage records, Somerset House. The initials seemed to burn on the page, and when Miss Marple glanced up, she found Mrs. Lestrange watching her with an expression of barely controlled terror. Such fascinating stories these old books contain, Miss Marple murmured, closing the volume gently. One never knows what connections might come to light after all these years. Mrs. Lestrange's face had gone quite pale, and she excused herself hastily, claiming a sudden headache. As she hurried toward the door, Miss Marple noticed that her hands were trembling, and she reflected that sometimes the most dangerous secrets were those that people believed they had successfully buried in the past. Mrs. Lestrange's hasty departure left a palpable tension in the parish hall, like the moment after lightning when thunder is expected but has not yet arrived. Inspector Crail made a careful note in his book, his gaze following the young woman's retreating figure through the window before returning to the assembled company with renewed focus. Miss Marple continued her gentle examination of the folklore volume, though her attention was equally divided between the printed words and the reactions they had provoked among those present. The inspector's methodical nature asserted itself as he turned to examine the brown paper wrapping that had contained the precious book. Miss Marple, with the sort of mild curiosity that elderly ladies were permitted, requested a brief look at the packaging materials. "I have a cousin who swears by a particular stationer," she explained with gentle vagueness, "and I wondered if this might be from the same establishment." Inspector Crail, perhaps recognizing something in her quiet manner that suggested more than idle curiosity, handed over the wrapping without objection. Miss Marple's experienced fingers smoothed the brown paper delicately, noting immediately how the creases ran twice over themselves, as though the package had been folded to fit one size of book and then refolded to accommodate another. The address was written in black ink with the same sensibly squared capitals she had observed in the margin notations, unmistakably Eleanor Finch's careful handwriting. More telling still were the knots in the string, tight reef knots pulled with the sort of domestic caution that every housewife employed when securing precious parcels. In Miss Marple's considerable experience, commercial dealers favored slip knots or paper tape for ease of opening and rewrapping, and they rarely trusted handwritten addresses when printed labels were readily available. "How curious," she murmured, her fingertips encountering the roughness where the string had cut into the paper. "Timothy, dear, you collected this from the station at 11 o'clock, you said?" The young man nodded earnestly. "Just as Miss Finch arranged when she telephoned yesterday afternoon. Mr. Jenkins made me sign the book because Miss Finch's parcels were always valuable. Everyone knew that." Inspector Crail's interest sharpened. And who else was at the station at that time? Timothy's brow furrowed with the effort of recollection. Mr. Penhaligon was there sending a telegram, and old Mr. Croot with a newspaper bundle. Perhaps the vicar's wife passing through with her basket of eggs for the London train. Mr. Penhaligon laughed before anyone could comment, his voice booming with characteristic theatrical flair. "The life of letters requires one to hound one's publisher by telegram more often than good taste allows, I'm afraid. I had no time for parcels, and certainly no interest in another man's folklore when my own invention supplies everything necessary." Miss Marple's keen eyes noted that while Mr. Penhaligon's cuffs were immaculate, there clung to the edge of his right sleeve the faintest dusting of pale powder, easily dismissed as flour from a baker's handshake, except that the village baker wore dark sleeves and flour had a different quality entirely. This powder looked remarkably similar to the French chalk she had observed at Miss Finch's cottage. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Mr. Penhaligon, with the air of a man wrestling with his conscience, suddenly cleared his throat. "Inspector, there's something I perhaps should mention about Mrs. Lestrange. She's been asking rather pointed questions since arriving in the village, specifically about property records and family genealogies related to Meadowbrook Manor." Mrs. Swettenham looked genuinely startled. But Meadowbrook's been empty for decades. The estate was broken up and sold after the war. There's nothing left but ruins and the old gatehouse. Precisely what makes her interest so intriguing, Mr. Penhaligon continued, warming to his subject with novelistic enthusiasm. She approached me several weeks ago, claiming to research a book about Victorian domestic life. Asked specifically about servants who had worked at the great houses, particularly governesses and companions. Said she needed authentic details about their daily lives and social positions. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused almost imperceptibly. "How very specific," she observed mildly. "Did she mention any particular time period?" "The 1890s, and she was particularly interested in the Ashford family who owned Meadowbrook. Asked what had become of them after they left the area so suddenly." Mr. Penhaligon's expression grew more serious. I told her what little I knew about the old scandal, though I couldn't recall exact details at the time. Inspector Crail looked up from his notes with evident interest. "What scandal?" "The usual sort of thing that plagued great houses in those days. A young woman in their employ disappeared under mysterious circumstances. There were rumors about improper relationships, possible pregnancy, the sort of gossip that could destroy a family's reputation. The Ashfords left rather suddenly for London, which only fueled the speculation. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern in Miss Marple's mind, though the complete picture remained tantalizingly elusive. The notation, CL, verify marriage records, took on new significance when considered alongside Mrs. Lestrange's obvious distress and her pointed inquiries about the Ashford family. Timothy Dane, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable as the conversation progressed, suddenly spoke up with the sort of blurted honesty that comes from nervous tension. "There's something else about Mrs. Lestrange, Inspector. She's been receiving letters from London, official-looking ones with Somerset House postmarks. They come regular-like, and she always seems nervous when they arrive." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes sharpened with interest. Somerset House was where England's vital records were kept, where one went to verify births, marriages, and deaths. Someone was indeed checking official records, and the pattern was becoming clearer with each revelation. Dr. Haydock, who had been listening with growing fascination, suddenly contributed his own observation. "You know, there's something familiar about Mrs. Lestrange's features, particularly around the eyes. I couldn't place it initially, but now that we're discussing the old families—" He paused, clearly working through a memory. "My predecessor, Dr. Bramwell, kept meticulous records for 40 years. He attended most of the prominent families in the area. I wonder if his notes might shed light on this business." Inspector Crail seized on this possibility with evident relief. A case that had begun with apparent burglary was developing complications that suggested motives far more complex than simple theft. "Dr. Haydock, I'd be most grateful if you could examine those records. Any connection between Mrs. Lestrange and the area's history could prove relevant." As the inspector prepared to take more formal statements, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the curious way secrets from the past had of surfacing at the most inconvenient moments. Eleanor Finch had discovered something significant in her folklore collection, something that connected a long-dead scandal to someone living in the present day. The murderer had been clever enough to stage a convincing burglary, but had overlooked the simple fact that the book they sought to suppress had already been delivered to its intended audience. Mrs. Swettenham, gathering her belongings with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to organizing village affairs, paused beside Miss Marple's chair. "Such a terrible business," she murmured. Poor Eleanor was so excited about her research. She said she'd uncovered a story that would surprise everyone, particularly those who thought they knew all about the local family's histories. "Did she mention anyone specifically?" Miss Marple inquired with casual interest. "She did say something rather dramatic about people living under false pretenses for years, and that truth had a way of coming to light eventually. I thought she was being theatrical, but now—" Mrs. Swettenham trailed off, her expression troubled. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. In her considerable experience of human nature, She had learned that those who lived under false pretenses often went to extraordinary lengths to protect their deceptions, and that murder was not beyond the realm of possibility when someone's entire carefully constructed identity was threatened with exposure. Through the window, she caught sight of Mrs. Lestrange walking rapidly toward the village outskirts with the determined gait of someone who had reached a difficult decision. The young woman's posture suggested flight, and Miss Marple wondered if they would find Rose Cottage empty when they next called upon its tenant. In her experience, guilty parties often chose the worst possible moments to run, thereby confirming suspicions that might otherwise have remained mere speculation. Yet something about the young woman's terror seemed too genuine, too deeply rooted, to be explained by simple guilt over murder. Fear, Miss Marple knew, could stem from many sources, and the truth was rarely as straightforward as it first appeared. Inspector Creel's methodical nature asserted itself immediately following Mrs. Lestrange's abrupt departure. Within minutes, he had dispatched Constable Phillips to Rose Cottage with instructions to bring the young woman in for formal questioning, while requesting that Dr. Haydock examine any historical medical records that might shed light on the Ashford family's sudden departure from the area decades earlier. Miss Marple observed these efficient arrangements with quiet approval, though her pale blue eyes remained fixed on the folklore volume that continued to rest on the central table like an unexploded shell. The walk to Rose Cottage proved illuminating in ways that Inspector Creel had not anticipated. Rather than finding the house abandoned, they discovered Mrs. Lestrange in her small parlor, though clearly in a state of considerable distress. A single suitcase lay open upon the sofa, but instead of clothes, it contained a carefully organized collection of documents. Letters tied with faded ribbon, official certificates, and a photograph in an old Morocco frame that immediately caught Miss Marple's attention. "You mustn't think me running away," Mrs. Lestrange said quickly, turning from the window where she had been watching their approach. Her face was pale but composed, and there was a dignity in her bearing that spoke of difficult decisions faced with courage. "I was merely gathering some papers that I thought might be relevant to your investigation. When I heard about poor Miss Finch, I realized that what she had discovered might place me in a very awkward position." Inspector Creel's expression remained professionally neutral, though Miss Marple detected a flicker of surprise at finding their suspect still in residence. "Mrs. Lestrange, it would be helpful if you could explain your connection to Miss Finch and your interest in the Ashford family. Several people have mentioned your inquiries about Meadowbrook Manor." Mrs. Lestrange sank into a chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "My maiden name was Catherine Lestrange. I came to Chipping Cleghorn because I believed there might be a connection between my family and this area. My grandmother, you see, was also named Catherine Lestrange, and according to family stories, she had worked as a governess somewhere in this district during the 1890s. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused almost imperceptibly. The photograph on the table showed a young woman in the severe dark dress typical of Victorian governesses, but there was something about the set of the features that seemed familiar, an echo of the woman who sat before them now. "Miss Finch had been helping me research this connection," Mrs. Lestrange continued, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. "She was remarkably knowledgeable about local history, and when I mentioned my grandmother's name, she became quite excited. She said she had recently acquired a book that contained stories about the area's prominent families, including something about a governess at Meadowbrook Manor." Dr. Haydock, who had been listening with growing interest, suddenly spoke up. "Mrs. Lestrange, I've just returned from examining my predecessor's medical records. Dr. Bramwell kept meticulous notes about his patients, including their family circumstances. There is indeed a record of a Catherine Lestrange who worked at Meadowbrook Manor in 1898. The silence that followed was profound. Mrs. Lestrange's hands tightened in her lap, while Inspector Creel made careful notes in his book. Miss Marple continued her gentle observation, noting particularly how the young woman's eyes had filled with tears that seemed to combine relief and apprehension in equal measure. according to Dr. Bramwell's records. Dr. Haydock continued gently. Your grandmother was delivered of a child in October 1898. The circumstances were kept very quiet, but there are indications that the father was someone within the Ashford household. The family left the area shortly afterward, and your grandmother disappeared from the district entirely. Mrs. Lestrange nodded slowly. My mother was that child. She was raised by adoptive parents in London, but she always wondered about her origins. When she died last year, I found letters among her possessions that hinted at the truth. That's what brought me here, to try to understand what really happened. Inspector Crail looked up from his notebook with renewed interest. And Miss Finch had discovered additional information about this situation? Yes. She telephoned yesterday evening, quite excited. She said she had found official documentation that would change everything, that it would prove my grandmother hadn't been simply an unfortunate young woman taken advantage of by her employer. Mrs. Lestrange reached for the morocco frame and carefully extracted a folded document. This arrived from Somerset House 3 days ago. It's a certified copy of a marriage certificate. Miss Marple leaned forward with polite interest as Inspector Crail examined the document. The certificate was dated April 20th, 1898, and recorded the marriage of Catherine Lestrange to Lionel Ashford at St. Cyprian's Church in Bloomsbury. The implications were staggering, suggesting that what had been dismissed as a scandalous liaison had actually been a legitimate marriage, deliberately concealed for reasons that could only be imagined. Miss Finch was tremendously excited about this discovery. Mrs. Lestrange continued. She said it explained why the Ashford family had left the area so suddenly. If Lionel Ashford had secretly married his children's governess, and she had borne him a legitimate heir, it would have created enormous complications for the family's social position and financial arrangements. Miss Marple's sharp eyes had been taking in details that others might have overlooked. The suitcase contained not just documents, but also a small leather journal, and scattered around it were several items that bore traces of the same white powder she had observed at Miss Finch's cottage. Mrs. Lestrange, you mentioned visiting Miss Finch yesterday. Did you handle any of her books or papers during your visit? Yes, she showed me several volumes from her collection, including some preliminary notes she had made about the Ashford family. We were both wearing gloves because the old papers were so delicate, and she used some sort of powder to prevent our fingers from sticking to the pages. French chalk, Miss Marple murmured, half to herself. The detail was small but significant, explaining the presence of the powder at the crime scene in a way that cast doubt on the theory that Mrs. Lestrange had been involved in any violent struggle. Inspector Crail was studying the marriage certificate with growing amazement. If this document is genuine, it suggests that your grandmother's child, your mother, was the legitimate heir to whatever portion of the Ashford estate was settled on Lionel Ashford. That could represent a considerable sum of money, even after all these years. That's exactly what Miss Finch said, Mrs. Lestrange replied. She believed there might be legal implications, particularly if any of the Ashford property had been sold or transferred based on the assumption that Lionel had died without legitimate heirs. Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the curious way that old secrets had of creating new dangers. If Mrs. Lestrange's claim was valid, it could indeed affect property rights and inheritances that had been settled for decades. More troubling still, it suggested that someone in the present day had a vested interest in ensuring that this particular truth remained buried, even if it meant resorting to murder. As they prepared to return to the parish hall with Mrs. Lestrange and her precious documents, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that they were still missing crucial pieces of the puzzle. The marriage certificate explained Mrs. Lestrange's presence in Chipping Cleghorn and her interest in Miss Finch's research, but it didn't explain who had killed the elderly historian or why they had chosen such a dramatic and violent method to suppress the truth. In her considerable experience, when people went to such lengths to conceal information, there were usually more secrets involved than anyone initially suspected, and the most dangerous revelations were often those that seemed most innocuous on the surface. The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the village lanes as they walked back toward the parish hall, and Miss Marple reflected that what had begun as a simple case of burglary and murder was revealing itself to be something far more complex. Somewhere in Chipping Cleghorn walked a person who had killed to protect a secret, and she suspected that before this matter was resolved, more than one carefully constructed life would be exposed to the harsh light of truth. The return to the parish hall brought with it an odd sense of displacement, as though the familiar room had been subtly rearranged while they were away. Miss Marple settled herself once more in her chair by the window, noting how the late afternoon light now slanted differently across the central table where Whispers of the Downs lay waiting like a patient witness. Inspector Crail placed Mrs. Lestrange's marriage certificate beside the folklore volume, and the two documents seemed to regard each other with a sort of significance that made the assembled company speak in hushed tones. Mrs. Swettenham, ever practical in her approach to village crises, had prepared fresh tea during their absence, though the cups sat largely untouched as everyone's attention focused on the implications of Mrs. Lestrange's revelation. The marriage certificate, if genuine, changed everything about the case, transforming what had appeared to be a simple matter of historical curiosity into something with potentially explosive contemporary consequences. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes had been drawn repeatedly to the folklore book, and she found herself studying it with the sort of gentle persistence she might apply to a particularly challenging knitting pattern. Something about its behavior troubled her, though she couldn't immediately identify what. When Inspector Crail opened it to show Mrs. Lestrange the relevant page, the volume fell naturally to the story of the Meadowbrook governess, just as it had done earlier. Miss Marple requested permission to examine it more closely, and as she lifted the book, she noticed the faintest trace of white powder along the foredge of the pages. "French chalk," she murmured, half to herself, recognizing the substance that Eleanor Finch had used to protect delicate old papers. But this application seemed different, more deliberate, as though someone had been training the book to open consistently to that particular page. The paper showed the sort of subtle conditioning that came from repeated handling, and there were faint indentations in the margins that suggested careful study. Dr. Haydock, who had been examining his predecessor's medical records with growing fascination, suddenly looked up with an expression of genuine concern. "Inspector, I've discovered something rather significant about the Ashford family's departure from the area. According to Dr. Bramwell's notes, when they left Meadowbrook Manor so suddenly, they didn't simply disappear into obscurity. Lionel Ashford's sister, Beatrice, remained in the district for many years, living quietly in a cottage near the old mill." "And what became of her?" Inspector Crail inquired, his attention sharpening. "She died in 1935, but her will is quite interesting. She left her remaining property, which included several valuable acres adjoining the original Ashford estate, to someone she described as her dear cousin's son. That property was subsequently developed and now forms a significant portion of the residential area on the village's northern edge." Mrs. Lestrange had grown very pale during this recitation, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "If my grandmother's marriage to Lionel Ashford was legitimate," she said quietly, "then my mother would have been his rightful heir, not his sister's chosen beneficiary." The implications hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Property that had been owned and developed for decades based on one understanding of inheritance rights might suddenly be subject to entirely different claims. Miss Marple reflected that such revelations had a way of creating very modern motives for very ancient crimes. Timothy Dane, who had been shifting nervously from foot to foot throughout the conversation, suddenly spoke up with the sort of blurted honesty that comes from guilty knowledge. "Inspector, sir, there's something I should mention about yesterday afternoon. When I was making my deliveries, I saw Mr. Croft's motor car parked near Miss Finch's cottage. He was there for quite a long time, perhaps an hour or more." "Gerald Croft, the solicitor?" Inspector Crale's voice carried a new edge of interest. Yes, sir. He handles most of the property transactions in the village, including some of Miss Finch's own legal affairs. I thought it was just business, but now... Timothy trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with the implications of his observation. Miss Marple's knitting needles had resumed their gentle rhythm, but her mind was working with considerably more urgency. Gerald Croft would have been in an excellent position to understand the legal implications of Mrs. Lestrange's research, particularly if his own family's property holdings were based on inheritance claims that might be challenged by the discovery of Lionel Ashford's legitimate marriage. Mr. Penhaligon, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during these revelations, suddenly cleared his throat with evident discomfort. I'm afraid I must add something to young Timothy's observation. Gerald Croft approached me several days ago with some rather pointed questions about the folklore collection Miss Finch had acquired. He seemed particularly interested in whether it contained any legally significant documents, and he asked specifically about stories related to the Ashford family. Did you tell him about Mrs. Lestrange's inquiries? Inspector Crale asked with professional directness. Mr. Penhaligon looked genuinely uncomfortable. I may have mentioned that there had been some recent interest in the family's history. Gerald seemed quite concerned about the potential for what he called unfounded claims that might complicate existing property arrangements. Miss Marple found herself thinking about the careful way the folklore book had been conditioned to open to the governor's story, and about the traces of French chalk she had observed both at the crime scene and on the book itself. Someone had wanted to ensure that the relevant page would be easily found. But that same someone had also attempted to erase Eleanor Finch's marginal notation about verifying marriage records. The combination suggested both preparation and panic, the sort of contradictory behavior that occurred when carefully laid plans went suddenly awry. Inspector Crale closed his notebook with a decisive snap. I think it's time we had a conversation with Mr. Croft. His knowledge of the legal implications, combined with his presence at Miss Finch's cottage yesterday, certainly warrants investigation. As they prepared to leave the parish hall, Miss Marple requested one final look at the folklore volume. The story of Catherine Lestrange, the governess of Meadowbrook Manor, seemed to shimmer on the page with new significance, no longer a quaint tale of Victorian scandal, but a testament to a love that had been legitimate, a marriage that had been real, and a truth that someone had been willing to kill to suppress. The afternoon shadows were lengthening as they walked toward Gerald Croft's office, and Miss Marple reflected that what had begun as a pleasant literary gathering had revealed itself to be something far more complex. In her considerable experience of human nature, she had learned that when family fortunes were threatened by inconvenient truths, the lengths to which people would go to protect their interests could be quite extraordinary indeed. Somewhere in the gathering dusk of Chipping Cleghorn, a killer walked free, and she suspected that the final revelation would prove as carefully orchestrated as the book that had been trained to turn its own page. Gerald Croft's office occupied the ground floor of a Georgian building that faced the village square with an air of impeccable respectability. The brass nameplate beside the door gleamed with the sort of careful maintenance that suggested prosperity, while the interior displayed the comfortable authority of 3 generations of country solicitors. Law books in orderly ranks lined the walls, their leather spines bearing the slight sag that came from frequent consultation, and a green-shaded lamp cast a pool of sober light over a blotter that showed the disciplined hand of a man who seldom wasted ink. Croft rose as they entered, his manner grave but controlled, expressing the expected condolences about Eleanor Finch in terms that were neither perfunctory nor particularly warm. Miss Marple noticed immediately how his eyes moved swiftly to the papers Inspector Crale carried, pausing momentarily when he glimpsed the outline of Mrs. Lestrange's certificate. The solicitor's usually composed demeanor showed subtle signs of strain, though he maintained his professional courtesy with practiced skill. "Inspector, what a dreadful business about poor Eleanor," Croft said, his voice carefully modulated. I understand there was some sort of disturbance at her cottage. Such a shock for our quiet village." Inspector Crail wasted no time on pleasantries. "Mr. Croft, we understand you visited Miss Finch yesterday afternoon. Several witnesses place you there for an extended period." Croft's response came perhaps a fraction too quickly, as though rehearsed. "Yes. Miss Finch consulted me about the legal ramifications of some historical discoveries. She had questions about property records from the 1890s, particularly relating to the old Ashford estate. I advised caution, as a public announcement could have resulted in unpleasant litigation." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes had been taking in details that others might have overlooked. On Croft's desk stood a small wooden box containing the tools of someone who handled delicate documents: a bone folder, a precision knife, and a soft brush. Beside it, the faintest dusting of white powder was visible on the dark mahogany, and Croft's right thumb bore a pale sheen that looked remarkably like the French chalk she had observed at Miss Finch's cottage. "Tell us about the Ashford property arrangements," Inspector Crail continued, opening his notebook with professional efficiency. Croft moved to a steel cabinet, producing a manila folder with the sort of smooth efficiency that suggested frequent access. "My late father handled Miss Beatrice Ashford's estate. When she died in 1935, she bequeathed certain acreage to her cousin's son, one Edward Vane. The land was subsequently developed as Meadowbrook North Estates Limited. The directors included my father as trustee, Mr. Vane, and Albert Penhaligon." Arthur Penhaligon, who had accompanied them from the parish hall, shifted uncomfortably. "My father invested after the war. I inherited a minority interest, though I've scarcely paid attention to the details. Ground rents are collected automatically." Mrs. Lestrange, who had remained silent during the initial exchange, suddenly spoke with quiet determination. "Mr. Barnes, Croft, did Miss Finch show you this?" She produced the marriage certificate with steady hands, placing it carefully on his desk. The change in Croft's expression was subtle but unmistakable to Miss Marple's experienced observation. The careful composure slipped for just a moment, revealing something that looked remarkably like fear before professional control reasserted itself. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his reading glasses, and Miss Marple noted how he avoided touching the document directly. "If this certificate is genuine," Croft said finally, though his voice lacked conviction, "it would require extensive verification. Even then, the statute of limitations would preclude any challenges to property transfers that occurred decades ago." Dr. Haydock, who had been examining the folder's contents with growing concern, suddenly spoke up. "Mr. Croft, according to these documents, my family's medical practice sits on land that was part of the original Ashford bequest. If Mrs. Lestrange's claim is valid—" "Precisely why I advised Miss Finch to proceed with extreme caution," Croft interrupted, his professional mask beginning to show definite cracks. "Such revelations could affect dozens of property owners throughout the village." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she observed a small but telling detail. Among the papers in Croft's waste-paper basket lay crumpled sheets bearing Eleanor Finch's careful handwriting, and on the edge of his blotter, a faint smudge of dark green ink that matched exactly the notation she had seen erased from the folklore volume's margins. "When you visited Miss Finch yesterday," she said gently, "I suppose you handled some of her documents. She was always so particular about using proper precautions with old papers." "She insisted on gloves and that chalky powder," Croft admitted, his voice growing increasingly strained. "Eleanor was meticulous about such things." Inspector Crail's expression had grown increasingly grave as the implications became clear. The French chalk at the crime scene, the carefully copied research notes, and Croft's family's substantial financial interest in suppressing Eleanor Finch's discoveries painted a picture that went far beyond professional consultation. As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple reflected on how the book that had been trained to turn its own page was revealing secrets that threatened not just historical understanding, but contemporary fortunes. In her considerable experience, when people's entire world was built on foundations that could crumble with the revelation of inconvenient truths, they were capable of actions that would have seemed impossible under ordinary circumstances. The late afternoon shadows were lengthening outside Croft's windows, and she suspected that, before this matter was resolved, more than one carefully constructed life would be exposed to the harsh light of truth. The walk back from Gerald Croft's office carried with it the weight of unspoken suspicions, and Miss Marple found herself reflecting on how the evening light seemed to cast longer shadows than usual across the village square. Inspector Crail had requested that Dr. Haydock accompany them to examine his predecessor's medical records more thoroughly, particularly those relating to the Ashford family's final months in the area. The genealogical charts that Eleanor Finch had been so carefully constructing might hold the final pieces of a puzzle that was becoming increasingly clear. Dr. Haydock's surgery occupied a converted Georgian house near the church, its waiting room lined with the sort of comfortable chairs that had witnessed decades of village confidences. The medical records from Dr. Bramwell's era were kept in a locked cabinet, meticulously organized by year and family name. As Dr. Haydock produced the relevant files, Miss Marple noticed how Gerald Croft had grown increasingly pale, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, as though preventing them from trembling. "Here we are," Dr. Haydock announced, spreading several folders across his desk. Dr. Bramwell was extraordinarily thorough in his record-keeping. He noted not just medical details, but family circumstances, particularly when they affected his patient's welfare. He opened the Ashford family file, revealing pages of careful handwriting that chronicled births, deaths, and the social complexities that surrounded them. Inspector Crail leaned forward with professional interest. "What exactly did Dr. Bramwell record about the family's departure?" "Rather more than I initially realized," Dr. Haydock replied, turning to a page dated October 1898. According to these notes, when Catherine Lestrange gave birth to her daughter, there was considerable discussion about the child's legal status. Dr. Bramwell was present when Lionel Ashford acknowledged the marriage publicly. Though he notes that the family was under tremendous pressure to leave the area due to what he calls social complications beyond medical concern. Mrs. Lestrange, who had been listening with growing emotion, suddenly gasped. "He acknowledged the marriage? Then my mother was legitimate." "More than that," Dr. Haydock continued, his voice growing more serious. "Dr. Bramwell records that Beatrice Ashford, Lionel's sister, was furious about the acknowledgement. She had expected to inherit the estate herself, and the existence of a legitimate heir threatened those expectations. The doctor notes that she made several threats about ensuring the family name remained untainted by scandal." Miss Marple's knitting needles had resumed their gentle rhythm, but her pale blue eyes were fixed on Gerald Croft's face. The solicitor had grown progressively more agitated during Dr. Haydock's recitation, and she observed how his breathing had become shallow and rapid, the sort of pattern she associated with barely controlled panic. "Dr. Haydock," she said in her mild way, "I wonder if Dr. Bramwell's records show what became of the various family members after they left Meadowbrook Manor." "Indeed they do," the doctor replied, turning to another section of the file. "Lionel Ashford died in London in 1902, but not before making provisions for his wife and daughter. However, Beatrice Ashford returned to the area within a few years, purchasing property near the old mill. She lived quietly but apparently maintained correspondence with various family connections." Inspector Crail's attention had sharpened considerably. "What sort of family connections?" Dr. Haydock consulted his notes with growing fascination. "This is quite remarkable. According to Dr. Bramwell, Beatrice Ashford had a nephew, Edward Vane, who visited her regularly. The doctor treated the young man for various ailments over the years, and his notes indicate that Vane eventually changed his surname to Croft when he established himself professionally in the area." The silence that followed was profound. Gerald Croft's face had gone from pale to ashen, and he gripped the back of a chair with enough force to make his knuckles show white as bone china. Mrs. Lestrange stared at him with dawning comprehension, while Inspector Crail made rapid notes in his book. "Mr. Croft," Miss Marple said gently, "how very difficult this must be for you. To discover that your family's prosperity was built upon an inheritance that rightfully belonged to someone else." Croft's composure finally cracked. "You don't understand," he said desperately. "My great-aunt Beatrice believed she was protecting the family name. She never knew about the marriage certificate, never realized that Lionel's acknowledgement was legally binding. When she left her property to my grandfather, she thought she was preserving the Ashford legacy for the rightful heir." "But you knew differently," Inspector Crail observed with quiet authority. "When Mrs. Lestrange began her inquiries, when Miss Finch started researching the family genealogies, you realized that your family's entire foundation was built upon a misunderstanding." "Eleanor wouldn't listen to reason," Croft said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I tried to explain that revealing the truth would destroy innocent people, that property rights established for decades couldn't simply be overturned by some romantic notion about a Victorian marriage. But she was determined to present her findings to the Historical Society, regardless of the consequences." Miss Marple continued her gentle knitting, observing how the truth, once begun, seemed to flow from Gerald Croft like water from a broken dam. "And so you visited her yesterday evening, hoping for one final attempt at persuasion." Croft nodded miserably. "She laughed at me, said that truth had a way of coming to light eventually, and that she intended to share her discoveries with the world. She was going to destroy everything my family had built, everything I'd worked for." The confession, when it came, was delivered with the sort of exhausted relief that follows the end of a long and terrible struggle. Gerald Croft described how the conversation with Eleanor Finch had escalated, how his desperate pleas had been met with amused dismissal, and how, in a moment of panic, he had struck her with the bronze bookend. The staged burglary, the broken window, the scattered papers, all had been clumsy attempts to disguise a crime of passion as something more calculated. As Inspector Crail placed Gerald Croft under arrest, Miss Marple reflected on the curious way that secrets from the past had of surfacing at the most inconvenient moments. The folklore volume that had been trained to turn its own page had revealed truths that someone had been willing to kill to suppress. And she wondered how many other carefully guarded deceptions lay hidden in the quiet corners of England's villages, waiting for the right moment to emerge into the unforgiving light of day. The evening shadows were lengthening as they walked back toward the village square, and Miss Marple found herself thinking about the book that had started it all. Whispers of the Downs had indeed contained whispers, but they had been whispers of truth that refused to remain silent, no matter how carefully someone had tried to train them into submission. In her considerable experience of human nature, she had learned that truth, like water, always found its way through the smallest cracks, and that those who tried to dam it up often found themselves swept away by the very forces they had sought to control. The village square had emptied with the sort of subdued haste that followed dramatic revelations, yet Miss Marple found herself troubled by the nagging sensation that Gerald Croft's confession, while undoubtedly genuine, had not revealed the complete truth. As Inspector Crail completed the formalities of the arrest, she lingered in Dr. Haydock's surgery, ostensibly to comfort Mrs. Lestrange, but actually to examine once more the medical records that had proved so illuminating. In her considerable experience of human nature, desperate men often accepted blame for crimes that were larger than their individual actions, and something in Croft's manner suggested the relief of someone unburdening himself of guilt that had been shared, not solitary. The walk back to the parish hall carried with it an odd sense of unfinished business. Mrs. I. Swettenham had locked the building securely after their earlier departure. Yet as they approached, Miss Marple noticed immediately that the side door stood slightly ajar, its brass handle catching the lamplight with the sort of gleam that suggested recent handling. Inspector Crail's expression sharpened as he drew his torch. and the beam that swept the interior revealed a scene that spoke of hurried and desperate activity. The acrid smell reached them first, not the sharp reek of open flame, but the dull, smothered scent of papers deliberately burned. On the small platform where meeting minutes were usually kept, the waste paper basket smoldered with a carefully tamped glow, while scattered across the floor lay the charred remnants of what had clearly been Eleanor Finch's meticulous research notes. Timothy Dane sprang forward with a damp cloth to extinguish the last embers, revealing fragments of handwriting that spoke of genealogical charts and property records, now reduced to illegible ash. Most telling of all, the central table where Whispers of the Downs had been left stood conspicuously bare. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes swept the room with practiced efficiency, noting the pale rectangle of dust where the book had lain and, more significantly, the faint scattering of white powder that led from the table toward the piano alcove. Behind the curtain that screened the old upright, she discovered the folklore volume lying on its side, its four edges bearing fresh traces of French chalk and a new crease running down its spine as though it had been opened violently and then thrust shut in haste. "Someone came for the book," Inspector Crail observed grimly, his torch beam revealing muddy footprints that led from the side door to the table and back again. They meant to destroy Miss Finch's notes entirely, but something interrupted them. Miss Marple lifted the volume carefully, noting how its behavior had changed once again. When she allowed it to fall open naturally, it no longer settled immediately at the governor's story, but rocked uncertainly through several pages before coming to rest. Someone had been attempting to retrain the book's memory, to teach it a different obedience, but the hasty nature of the work had left telltale signs of the manipulation. The sound of approaching footsteps in the lane brought them all to immediate alertness, but the figure that appeared in the doorway was Arthur Penhaligon, flushed and breathless with explanations about having seen lights in the building and thinking he might be of assistance. His arrival struck Miss Marple as remarkably convenient, and she observed with interest how his sleeve bore a light dusting of what might have been flour from a baker's handshake, except that the village baker wore dark clothing and worked with coarser substances. The powder on Penhaligon's cuff had the fine, chalky quality she had come to associate with the manipulation of delicate old papers. "Such a terrible business," Penhaligon declared, his voice carrying its usual theatrical resonance, though his eyes darted once toward the heap of burned papers before settling into an expression of appropriate concern. "I do hope nothing irreplaceable has been lost." Miss Marple's knitting needles had resumed their gentle rhythm as she processed the implications of what they had discovered. Gerald Croft's confession had been genuine, but it had been the desperate act of a man who found himself the instrument of forces beyond his individual control. Someone else had been monitoring the situation. Someone who understood that even with Croft's arrest, damaging evidence remained to be destroyed. "Inspector," she said in her mild way, "I believe we may have been looking at this matter from an incomplete perspective. Mr. Croft's actions yesterday were certainly criminal, but they appear to have been part of a larger pattern of interference with Miss Finch's research." Dr. Haydock, who had been examining the burned fragments with growing concern, suddenly looked up with recognition dawning in his eyes. "The correspondence I mentioned earlier about Beatrice Ashford's regular visitors. Dr. Bramwell noted that one of them was described as the young man from the publishing firm. Someone who would have understood the value of controlling how historical information was presented to the public. The pieces were falling into place with the sort of inevitable logic that Miss Marple had learned to trust. Arthur Penhaligon's expertise in historical research, his access to Miss Finch's work through the Literary Society, and his family's financial interest in the property developments that Mrs. Lestrange's claim might threaten, all combined to paint a picture of someone who had been orchestrating events from behind the scenes while allowing Gerald Croft to bear the immediate consequences. As Inspector Crail prepared to secure the scene more thoroughly, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the curious way that truth had multiple layers, like the pages of a book that had been trained to tell different stories depending on how it was opened. The folklore volume had indeed been made to turn its own page, but not in the way that Eleanor Finch had intended when she chose that particular title for her discovery. Instead, it had become a tool in the hands of someone who understood that controlling the narrative was often more effective than destroying it entirely. The evening shadows were lengthening across the village square, and Miss Marple suspected that before this matter was fully resolved, one more carefully constructed deception would need to be exposed to the harsh light of truth. In her considerable experience of human nature, she had learned that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most helpful, most concerned, most eager to assist in the very investigations that threatened to expose their carefully hidden guilt. The acrid smell of burned papers lingered in the parish hall like an accusation, and Miss Marple found herself studying Arthur Penhaligon with the sort of gentle attention she might give to a particularly complex knitting pattern. His arrival at precisely the moment when evidence was being destroyed struck her as remarkably convenient, though she kept this observation to herself as Inspector Crail methodically examined the charred fragments scattered around the wastepaper basket. Mrs. Lestrange, who had been examining the damaged folklore volume with growing distress, suddenly looked up with dawning comprehension. "Miss Marple, when I visited Miss Finch yesterday morning, she mentioned that someone from the Literary Society had been asking very detailed questions about my research. She seemed quite pleased, said it showed how seriously people took historical accuracy." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple murmured, her pale blue eyes fixed on Penhaligon's face. "Did she mention who had shown such scholarly interest?" "Someone who understood the importance of verifying sources before making public announcements. She was particularly impressed that this person had offered to help check her findings through contacts in London publishing houses." Mrs. Lestrange's voice carried a note of growing unease. "She said they had been most helpful in explaining the potential complications of her discoveries." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she processed this information. In her considerable experience, when helpful strangers offered to verify inconvenient truths, their assistance rarely served the interests of accuracy. She found herself thinking about the careful way someone had trained the folklore book to open to specific pages and about the sort of expertise required for such delicate manipulation. "Mr. Penhaligon," she said in her mild way, "you mentioned earlier that you often consulted with Miss Finch about historical details. I suppose you would have been familiar with her methods for preserving delicate documents." Penhaligon's response came with theatrical warmth, though Miss Marple noticed how his hands remained carefully clasped behind his back. Eleanor was meticulous about such things, always insisted on gloves and that chalky powder to prevent damage to old papers. French chalk, I believe she called it. "How very knowledgeable," Miss Marple observed, noting the faint white dusting that still clung to his right cuff despite his careful positioning. "Such a distinctive substance, isn't it? It has a way of transferring to everything it touches, rather like flour, though much finer in texture." Inspector Crail, who had been examining the muddy footprints with growing interest, looked up sharply. "Mr. Penhaligon, these tracks suggest someone familiar with the building's layout. They lead directly to where the book was placed, then to the piano alcove where we found it hidden." "I've attended countless meetings here over the years," Penhaligon replied, though his theatrical confidence was beginning to show strain. "Anyone familiar with the society would know the room's arrangement." Miss Marple lifted the folklore volume carefully, allowing it to fall open naturally. Instead of settling immediately at the governess story as it had been trained to do, the book wavered uncertainly through several pages before coming to rest. "How curious," she murmured. "Someone has been attempting to retrain its memory, but the work was done hastily. Books, like people, remember their original conditioning even when someone tries to teach them new habits." Dr. Haydock, who had been studying the burned fragments with methodical attention, suddenly held up a partially preserved scrap. "This appears to be part of a letter in Miss Finch's handwriting, addressed to a London publisher. I can make out the words immediate publication, and financial arrangements. The implications struck everyone simultaneously. Miss Finch had not simply been researching local history for academic purposes. She had been preparing to publish her findings in a form that would reach far beyond the village boundaries. Such publication would have made it impossible to suppress the information about Mrs. Lestrange's legitimate claim, regardless of local interests. Timothy Dane, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable, suddenly blurted out with nervous honesty, "Mr. Penhaligon asked me specifically about Miss Finch's parcel yesterday morning. Seemed very interested when I mentioned it was a book from London." Natural curiosity, Penhaligon said quickly, but his voice had lost its usual resonance. Eleanor's research was always fascinating to a fellow writer. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes had sharpened with understanding. Fascinating enough to require careful monitoring, I should think. When one's family fortune depends upon maintaining certain historical assumptions, new discoveries can be quite threatening, particularly when they suggest that property rights established for decades might be based upon incomplete information. The silence that followed was profound. Penhaligon's theatrical composure finally cracked entirely, revealing the desperate man beneath. In her considerable experience of human nature, Miss Marple had learned that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most helpful, most concerned with historical accuracy, most eager to assist in the very investigations that threatened to expose their carefully hidden interests. Inspector Crale's notebook was ready as the truth began to emerge, piece by careful piece, like a book finally opening to reveal its most closely guarded secrets. Miss Marple's voice was as gentle as the afternoon light filtering through the parish hall windows, but there was a quiet certainty in her gaze as she turned to Timothy Dane. Would he fetch the Tennyson volume from Miss Finch's lectern, the one with the pressed flower? Timothy, eager and earnest, hurried off while the room seemed to hold its breath. Inspector Crale, his pencil poised, watched Arthur Penhaligon, who had steadied himself by the old piano and wore the anxious look of someone who suspects the scenery is about to collapse. Mrs. Lestrange sat quietly, her eyes full of questions and hope. Timothy returned, carrying the slim green book as if it were something precious. Miss Marple opened it gently, revealing the pressed flower, its petals browned by years of sunlight. Behind it, hidden in the gutter of the binding, was a folded slip of paper. She passed it to Inspector Crale, who unfolded it with care. It was Eleanor Finch's swift, tidy hand, a penciled tracing of her marginal note. COAs. Verify marriage records. Somerset House. A list of recent visitors, Croft, Penhaligon, and Mrs. L. And a telling line, "Book now turns itself, showed Mr. P. trick with chalk, his idea to prepare audience." Penhaligon's hands tensed, the chalk dust on his cuff suddenly conspicuous. He managed a brittle smile, but the performance was gone. "She was a friend. We talked about techniques. Any literary man might—" Miss Marple's knitting resumed its placid rhythm. "Yet it was you, Mr. Penhaligon, who suggested teaching the book to fall open to the story you wanted, and who erased Eleanor's note about verifying the marriage. You were seen at the station, taking an interest in Timothy's parcel, and you were present each time Eleanor's discoveries moved closer to the truth. When Mr. Croft's panic led to tragedy, you seized the chance to finish what you'd begun, burning her notes, retraining the book, and hiding it in the dustiest alcove, all under the guise of helpfulness." Inspector Crale continued. "You manipulated Croft, pushing him to desperation, then tried to ensure that nothing remained to threaten your family's property or reputation. The chalk, the footprints, the erased notes, all point to your hand." Penhaligon's resistance faltered. He looked at Mrs. Lestrange, at the inspector, and finally at Miss Marple, whose gentle gaze held a deeper firmness. "I didn't want to hurt her," he said, voice low. "But my family, our standing, it was all built on assumptions. I only wanted to help keep the peace." If the book could be made to tell a less dangerous story, perhaps the village could go on quietly. But Eleanor wouldn't let it rest. She believed in truth, even if it hurt. Miss Marple's reply was kind but unyielding. It wasn't just a story, Mr. Penhaligon. It was the record of lives, of Catherine Lestrange, of her daughter, and of those who came after. Justice is not always comfortable, but it is necessary. As Inspector Crail formally arrested Penhaligon for his role in the destruction and concealment of evidence, and as accessory to Croft's crime, the weight in the room eased. Mrs. Lestrange stood, not triumphant, but finally at peace, knowing her family's truth would endure. The legal matters would be resolved with care, no one would lose their home, and settlements would be fair. But what mattered most to her was that her grandmother's name and her own place in the world were finally acknowledged. In the days that followed, the village moved on with the briskness that comes after upheaval. The parish hall's smoky scent lingered, and stories of Eleanor Finch's stubbornness and kindness passed through the lanes like a healing wind. Gerald Croft awaited trial. His life diminished but not destroyed. Penhaligon wrote his public letter, full of high-minded phrases that convinced no one. Mrs. Lestrange, now Mrs. Ashford, as the village quietly adopted the rightful name, became a part of the community, her dignity restored. Miss Marple, walking the lanes as autumn gave way to winter, reflected on the book that had turned its own page and the hands that had tried to teach it obedience. She knew, as only she could, that the truths pressed between the petals of memory and the leaves of books endure, no matter how artfully someone tries to erase or redirect them. Justice in the village of Chipping Clegg Horn had found its way, imperfect perhaps, but real. The truth, like a flower preserved in the pages of a well-loved book, would outlast the storms of secrecy and the efforts of those who sought to train it to their own ends. And so, as the postman passed her garden gate with a new delivery, perhaps another story, another whisper, Miss Marple smiled. Lives and stories alike would always find their way toward the light, for memory, like truth, is stubborn and blooms where one least expects it.